Josh Frey on VikesNow, the weekly spot. It's August 24th. How are you, sir?
I'm doing good, my man. How are you?
Not bad at all. So is it my understanding that you either are or will soon be the head honcho at purpleptsd.com?
Yeah, start of September. Sound like that's gonna be the case here. So looking forward to that. It's gonna be a
Oh
good
yeah.
time.
And you certainly deserve it based on your work ethic and the way that you write. I want to tell the viewers that purpleptsd.com, it's on Josh's hat there. And
hmm
then the Vikings territory, our sister sites. Our founder, Joe Johnson, came up with the sites. Purple PTSD actually came first in 2015, and then he purchased Vikings territory about 5 years ago. So it was a spot where he could have different styles of writers having different takes on the Vikings. So we're basically joined at the hip, which means the two people on VikesNow today are joined at the hip via writing and then for today's purposes. So welcome aboard in that capacity, sir. It's excellent to have you as the I guess the editor, so to speak.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. But I mean, before we get started here, I think
Mm-hmm.
all the viewers are wondering, how did your son's first day of kindergarten go yesterday?
Well, wonderful. This is kind of a strange story. So he's kind of particular about certain things. So yesterday, before we left the house, he claimed that he used the bathroom and he got pee on his pants,
Oh
which
no.
which usually means that he gets a droplet. And so he let that kind of discourage him for a little bit. And we got to kindergarten and waiting in line, and he was still downtrodden about that. So I couldn't tell if that was really dragging his mood down or if he was anxietal about the first day. Lo and behold, I picked him up yesterday about 3:15, and he didn't want to leave.
Oh.
So yeah, so yeah, it was awesome. And then today was kind of just a normal kid drop off where it's like, all right, time to go to school. I take my daughter to middle school, which is like 5 blocks away, and I dropped him off. And the cool part of it today was everybody was kind of in line, and some were already playing, waiting for school to start. And I said, are you good or do you want me to stay? And he said, I think you can take off. And,
Dang.
from a
Oh.
5 year old, the vocabulary is badass. And then just that reassurance that I got this was pretty cool.
That's awesome. That's all. He's been going to like daycare and stuff already, though, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah. He spent 3 wonderful years with my mom. She had him one on one from 2016 or about 2017 to 2020. And
gotcha.
then the pandemic hit and the world kind of got screwy. So he ended up going to a great place called Tiger Tots in Harrisburg, South Dakota. And the teacher there ran it like a school. And her name is Autumn. And he really, that's kind of when we learned that this is a smart son of a gun. And so yeah, now he formally pivoted to kindergarten, and we'll see how he does. And yeah, he's getting into this Viking stuff. He watches the games, and
That's awesome.
we
That's
shall see if
awesome.
he's the heir apparent for the writing. I think he's got it in there with this vocabulary.
Yeah, I hope so. Let's see
All right,
it.
so for the Viking stuff, if I'm boring viewers with these family stories, I apologize, but we're gonna jump into this. I've asked Josh to come up with 5 do or dies for the final preseason game at Denver, and what I mean by that, I'm going to steal a little bit of Mr. Fry's thunder. Is Chris Thomason from Pioneer Press tweeted that they're going to have a punt off, which sounds a little dirty the way that it's worded, but it's a punt off between Jordan Berry and Ryan Wright to determine, which guy is it going to be. So in that regard, I thought, well, what other spots are do or die? So I'm gonna ask you to outline 5 of them, or if you got more, or you got fewer, that works too. So you might as well start with the punter one because I stole that one. Tell me the stakes for the punter and who you think comes out on top.
Yeah, so this situation, just the fact that it's even in the works here, it's really surprising to me. Just because I thought this was going to be kind of like the kicking competition with Greg Joseph and Gabe Burkich, where
Yeah.
it's like where Wright's in camp for a couple days just to get Jordan Berry like back up to speed and everything, like make
Mm-hmm.
him actually work for it. But I thought he'd be gone like around the same time. But he's made it through the second round of cuts, and now we're headed to the last preseason game with a punt off. And I mean, Barry had a bad punt last weekend
Mm-hmm.
against the Niners where it didn't even make it to midfield or anything. But I feel like that's I feel like that's just the one in a million, and it happened to be in the game where everybody was watching. So uh, I'd be very surprised if Barry didn't end up winning this job, just because one, he did a pretty decent job last year. I'd say I don't think there's any complaints on
Mm-mm.
that front. And then two, he's been Greg Joseph's holder this
Yeah,
entire time for his
that
kicks.
one's the biggie.
Yeah, so I feel like with how good he's been in training camp and preseason so far, you wouldn't want to mess with that chemistry at all. And there was the one practice where Joseph was like 6 of 8 or something on his kicks, and the two where he missed were when Wright was his holder. So I don't know. I'd be pretty surprised at this point if Wright won the job. But hey, if he goes out and wins it on Saturday, then kudos to him.
Yeah, the funny part is so not necessarily involving Kevin O'Connell or Kwesi Adolfo, but the very Vikings thing to do would be to keep the guy that's a shitty holder or is an unproven holder and hope for the best, because you'd be like, oh, here we go. We had a kicker that was just drilling 60 and 65 yarders, but then you went and messed it up with some unproven holder. I always have this weird relationship with kickers and punters that are rookies, because I always have this pristine view, like, well, let's go with the young guy because maybe he'll be, a top 3 punter, a top 3 kicker. We already know what we got in the other guy. But then I'm quickly brought back to earth in some of those situations where I'm like, oh, he ain't that good. It kind of happened with Daniel Carlson in the heat of the moment, anyhow, in 2018, or even when they had like Chase McLaughlin and stuff on the practice squad over and over. I would think like, oh man, this Dan Bailey's struggling. Just go with this young guy. It can't be any worse. And let's see if he takes off in the next big thing. It's dangerous thinking. But right now, I'm with you that it probably makes more sense to go with Barry. But it is certainly what Thomason calls a punt off. And I don't know that I've ever heard like, this one's for all the marbles for you two bros. So let's see it.
Yeah, it's going to be very exciting. Nothing more exciting on primetime football than a punt off between two guys.
Yep, just the verbiage to a punt off.
Yeah.
Yep, never heard it. All right, what's number 2 for do or die situations? Vikings, Broncos.
Number 2, I've got a couple choices that I could have gone with at wide receiver here, I think, but ultimately I landed on Myron Mitchell, just because the depth chart has had him on the third team for I think every single time it's been published so far. He had a really quiet game last weekend, whereas somebody like BC Johnson, he kind of took over the reins there during the game. And I feel like he needs to have a big game this week on the offensive side of the ball, just because he doesn't provide as much on the special teams as like a Jalen Naylor or a Dan Chizina would. And if he's going to be a producer for this team this year, it's going to have to be on the offensive side of the ball. So I think he needs a big game this weekend to really show that he can be that guy, that wide receiver 5 or 6, whatever it ends up being.
I think on the depth chart to mention that you had, I think it's very imperative to point out, either for fans, viewers of the show, or us as writers, that so far the depth chart has been a good indicator of what is true. When we had it on the live air 2 weeks ago, the release, I was trying to interpret, all right, is it alphabetical or these semicolons? What the hell does it mean? But when you actually flush it out, the dudes that they're cutting lived at the bottom. So we can use that going forward, next off season, that when they post something, it's not bullshit. The dudes that are going to get cut are probably towards the bottom of it. What do you say about Albert Wilson catching 2 touchdowns against the Raiders and then getting cut 10 days later? How does that mesh with, well, what if Mitchell catches 2 touchdowns? Does it even matter? Like, what do they need to see from him then if Wilson wasn't good enough?
I think Wilson was I think he was just in a really bad spot. I mean, he had his 2 touchdowns, but he's an older receiver, and the Vikings just have so many super talented young guys that it's like, we kind of know what Albert Wilson is. He's not going to knock your socks off every single week. Like, he did pretty decent in that preseason, but again, like we talked about with Mond last week, it was against mostly third stringers when he actually got his production. So yeah. I feel like that definitely played into account there. And I think Myron Mitchell, he's kind of like what you said with the kickers and punters. He's a little bit more unknown. So maybe he will end up being a guy that can flourish in this offense. So I think that's kind of the thinking going into this game.
Got it. Speaking of Mond, I'd like to point out that that's his performance against the 49ers was so damning because of what you just said. It was reservist players. It was dudes he theoretically should dominate. If he's ever going to dominate anybody, it should be those dudes. So, I mean, you can forgive a bad game. Any athlete has them, even the best of the best. But when you have 2 gruesome interceptions against their shitty players, that is a complete no-no. And I think that's why, Nick Mullins ultimately joined the organization.
And that honestly, that's a perfect transition into my next do or die, because I think Kellen Mond is a do or die for this game, I think,
Yeah.
because like you said, Mullins is in town now. Got him basically free, so that's awesome for the Vikings. I
Hmm.
think they've got their QB2 at least for this year. But I do think that if there's another really bad game for Kellen Mond where he just seems like he doesn't know where to go with the ball most of the game, there's a situation here where he could end up getting cut and the Vikings try to stash him on the practice squad rather than rostering him on the 53 man. I mean, there's a lot of teams out there that definitely go with only two quarterbacks,
Hmm.
and with how Mond has been performing after that game against the Raiders, or even just that second half against the Raiders, I think there's definitely a place where he could get cut in this final round here.
My goodness, that would be such a riches to rags story. Looking the part against the Raiders. He wasn't deadly, but threw two touchdown passes. When he settled in, he looked good. But it would be 1 year after you draft the dude as a potential contingency plan for your QB1, and he's already out the door. That would be really problematic. But ultimately, that's not their guy. Kwesi Adofo-Mensah and Kevin O'Connell, although they say very positive things about Mond in the coach speak, that ain't their guy. They have no loyalty to him other than the fact that he's employed there. And then on the note on keeping three quarterbacks, the Rams did that last year heading into the 2021 season, which was a triumphant one for them. So when the 53-man roster is released in 6 days, it will tell you for sure how they feel about Mond, because we all know Mullen's going to be QB2. He's going to be one of the better QB2s in football, in fact. But if Mond is the QB3, that will prove that, all right, we still like this guy and we're keeping him here on the active roster. But if you said if it's flat out cut or finds a way to wiggle to the practice squad, then yeah, it's bleak for his career outlook.
Yeah, it's so weird because like even after that draft, there were so many guys on the national stage that were like, man, this was such a steal for the Vikings. This guy's gonna be so good. And it's like now looking back on it, man, they should have just taken Davis Mills.
Yeah, there is a lot of things at play for Mon that have always confused me. And it's Chris Sims, who usually can call whether or not rookie quarterbacks are going to be good. He gave Mond the rubber stamp in a good way that said this dude, I think it was like the fourth best quarterback from the 2021 draft class. And I was like, all right, this guy is hardly ever wrong when he does power rankings before they even play games. However, on this very show, I had Ben Lieber come on, and then on my McKinney podcast, I talked with Paul Charchian, and they both told me into my face, they're like, yeah, Monding guy, he's raw and robotic. And if you think Cousins is robotic, wait for Mond. That's what Ben Lieber told me. So I was like, well, Ben Lieber played football, and I don't know who's right, Chris Sims or Ben Lieber. And at least for a week here, it seems that Lieber knew what he was talking about.
Yeah, just such a weird
Yeah.
situation how it's gone downhill so fast. Dang. Have to
Yeah.
feel bad for the guy.
Yeah. What I've been pondering, and we'll get on to the next one here in just a second, is whether or not a big game for Mond against the Broncos would erase the sins of the 49ers game, or if this is just an audition for Mullins, or like a just a complete cakewalk for Mullins to get QB2 no matter what Mond does. That one's tricky.
Yeah, I guess we'll just have to wait and see because
And,
I couldn't answer that one
yeah,
either.
and notably, we haven't mentioned Sean Mannion at all, and I think that's the
Yeah.
positivity from the Mullins trade. All right, do or die number, what is that? Number four.
Number four, I'm gonna go. I've got a lot of offensive players here, just because I feel like the defense is pretty much wrapped up at this point.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going with Zach Davidson,
Okay.
and I think his game last week was just such a disaster. Like
It
you
was.
that one pass where he was wide open, Sean Mannion hits him right in the hands. He could have walked into the end zone, and he just drops it. That was rough. And then he just he had a decent game against the Raiders. I feel like it just wasn't enough to really feel like, okay, this guy, if whatever happens this offseason, if Irv Smith isn't on the roster
Mm-hmm.
after this offseason, maybe he could step up and be the guy. I just haven't had that moment with him yet where it's like, maybe there's something here. So I feel like even if he has a decent game, he's going to end up being like tight end four. And then
Mm-hmm.
we're going to go into this season, barely see him at all, other than maybe a few special teams plays. and we're just going to be like, well, what do we do this offseason either way? So he needs to have a good game in order to save himself on the roster. But I was hoping that we'd see something from him at some point this preseason where it's like, okay, maybe we have a solution here at tight end. And I just haven't gotten that yet from him.
Yeah, I think he became, in these parts on these shows, prominent only because Irv Smith Jr. got hurt 45 minutes into his return. So we had to assume, just for the Daniil Hunter vibe of 2020, we had to assume that was going to drag into the season. And then therefore Johnny Munt would be TE1 and Ellefson or Davidson would battle for the backup job. However, it seems like Smith Jr. only or has a normal injury and he's on track. He's already back, in fact, at practice. So I think all the Davidson what ifs that we had kind of turn irrelevant because even if he plays like a complete badass against the Broncos, I don't know if there's a roster spot because we already know it's Smith, Munt, and then it's a debate between Ellefson and Davidson. And then his pal, Nick Muse, looked wonderful.
Yeah, he did. Yeah, he had a really good game. I think there might be a shot that he gets picked up off of waivers if he does get cut. So that'll be another interesting one to watch.
Yeah, if Nick Muse did exactly what you hope Davidson would do against the 49ers.
Yeah.
And then again, 100 disclaimers in a row. This was all preseason against the 49ers, and we get it that, it doesn't really matter. But then you have to ask yourself, why did they even play them? They have to see these guys showcase it, and it matters to an extent, just not if your name's Albert Wilson.
Right.
All right, what do you got? One or two more?
I got one more for you,
and
I'm gonna go with another 2021 third round pick here, Chaz Surratt. Yeah. And I think last week he showed a little something last week for like the first time in his entire NFL career. I felt like there was something here with this guy. I think he had a TFL in that game. He might have helped out on a sack too. And I think if there was ever a time for him to prove that he can be on a roster, he's got to do it right now because Blake Lynch, Troy Dye, Brian Asamoah are definitely ahead of him in the depth chart right now, I think. And if I feel like they could go into the season with 6 linebackers and maybe try to get him as like maybe a gunner on the special teams. But he's going to have to show something again this weekend for me to feel like he definitely deserves a spot.
Yeah, and then Connolly went to the pup or the reserve probably through at least first quarter of the season, if not more. So that helps him to an extent because Connolly always seems to be cherished by both. I mean, not cherished, but he always seems to be out there. And then, so it was cool to see him do something because at a third round price point, especially for a linebacker, he should have been doing stuff by now.
Right.
And then again, the same concept about this brand of front office has no loyalties to him. It would have been conceivable that if he had a turd of a game against the 49ers, that you'd never hear from him again. All right, my one other one, it's not a do or die, but I want to point out on this concept of does preseason matter is if T.Y. McGill doesn't make the 53-man roster, then you have to ask yourself, why do we analyze what these guys do in preseason games? Because he in the middle of the defense against 2 second string opponents with the Raiders and 49ers, he's looked absolutely wonderful. And the vibe is there, the numbers are there. And he was a guy that if you go look at my 53-man projection from 3 weeks ago, I didn't even contemplate him making the roster because I don't really know who he is. But he's shown I had to learn all about him in the last 2 weeks and for good reason because he deserved it. So if they find a way to not retain him, which I don't think will happen, I think he will make the 53-man roster. He's quite the journeyman too. He's been all over the place.
Yeah, I think this is like his 9th team now in 8 years or something. He ends up all over the place. Yeah, it's wild.
Yeah, but he was marvelous in both those games. And so it's always one of those tests where I see, all right, I need to figure out if preseason matters because if a guy like Albert Wilson catches 2 touchdowns and we say the hell with you, and then T.Y. McGill just marvelous, and then you cut them, then what do they see that I don't? I think that's what I end up reflecting. All right, let's run down them again. Punt off. Let's see, Myron Mitchell.
Yep.
What was number 3?
Number 3 was Kellen Mond.
Oh yeah, Kellen Mond for sure.
Then Zach Davidson, and then Chaz Surratt.
Okay, so those are basically, this was a roster bubble show, and to figure out what the Vikings and those specific men need to do this Saturday night in the final preseason. All right, sir. It's fried chicken, FREYED _ chicken on Twitter.
Yep.
And you're the boss man, or will be in about a week, on purpleptsd.com. You and I will collaborate on this show, continuing weekly throughout the season, and then of course with our writings and whatnots on both sites. Anything else? Closing arguments for the group?
Let's have a punt off, baby.
Yeah, we'll be back next week to analyze the punt off results. All right, good sir. We'll see you next week.
See ya.
Let's go, baby.